November 1519. The air above Tenochtitlan carries copal smoke and the low hum of 60,000 traders at the market of Tlatelolco, a city larger than any in Europe, built on a lake, sustained by a civilization that had never once doubted its permanence. Moctezuma II walks out to greet the man who will end him. He brings gifts, a feathered headdress, a throne of gold. He has received every warning. His astronomers catalog the omens. His own runners describe the weapons, the armor, the horses. And still his mind did what your mind does when belief and evidence stand in the same room. It chose belief. I was there. Stay with me. I have walked the causeways of every empire that no longer exists. That is not a credential. That is a burden. What brought Tenochtitlan down was not Spanish steel. It was not disease. It was a mechanism Leon Festinger would name in 1956 cognitive dissonance, the mind's method of preserving belief when evidence has already made belief untenable. By the time this is over, you will see it in Moctezuma. You will see it in yourself. To understand what Moctezuma surrendered, you first have to understand what he held. Tenochtitlan in 1519 was not a city in decline. It was a city at the height of everything it had ever imagined for itself. 300,000 people, maybe more, built on an island in the middle of Lake Texcoco, connected to the mainland by 3 causeways, wide enough to march 8 men abreast. The Spaniards who entered it, soldiers who had seen Seville, who had walked Rome, wrote home in confusion. Bernal Diaz del Castillo, a foot soldier in Cortés' army, wrote that some of his companions believed they were dreaming. The great temple rose 60 meters above the plaza floor. Priests had been climbing its steps for generations. The markets at Tlatelolco operated with a precision that would not exist in European commerce for another century. Fixed prices, dispute arbiters, goods arriving by canoe from every corner of the empire. This was the Triple Alliance: Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, Tlacopan, a tributary network that extracted wealth from 400 subject cities and stretched from the Gulf Coast to the Pacific. The Mexica did not consider themselves fortunate. They considered themselves chosen. Their state religion was not merely devotional, it was cosmological obligation. The sun required blood to rise. The empire existed to provide it. Every war, every sacrifice, every stone laid in the great temple was a transaction with a universe that would collapse without their participation. That belief was not superstition. It was the operating logic of a civilization that had never once been wrong about its own survival, until now.
Great Huitzilopochtli, accept this offering.
Walk with me
Guide
into the
us
city
with your
before
light.
noon. November 8th, 1519. You are standing at the southern end of the Iztapalapa Causeway, and the road beneath your feet is stone, not packed earth, not timber, but dressed volcanic stone, wide enough for 10 horses to walk abreast, stretching 2 leagues across the lake toward a city that seems, from this distance, to float. The water on either side of you is not silent. Canoes move in both directions, hundreds of them, flower sellers from Xochimilco, salt traders from the eastern marshes, ceramic merchants with their goods wrapped in agave fiber, moving with the unhurried efficiency of people who have never known their supply lines to fail. The smell is green. Algae and fresh water and the copal resin burning somewhere ahead of you, always burning, rising from the temple complex at the center of the island in a column you can see from the mainland. You are part of Hernan Cortés' column. There are roughly 400 Spanish soldiers, thousands of Tlaxcalan allies behind you, enemies of the Mexica, men who have waited years for this moment. And in front of you, coming down the causeway to meet you, is Moctezuma II himself, Lord of the Triple Alliance, carried on a litter with a canopy of green feathers and gold. He steps down. He greets Cortés. He places golden flowers around his neck. He calls him a lord. Now hold that image. Do not let it resolve into theater yet, because what you are watching is not submission. What you are watching is a man whose entire interpretive framework is working exactly as designed and working, at this precise moment, against him. Moctezuma had received reports. His intelligence network was not primitive. For months, his Pacteca long-distance merchants, who doubled as scouts, had been filing observations from the Gulf Coast. Strange vessels, men with hair on their faces, weapons that made thunder, animals larger than any known, moving fast enough to close distance before a warrior could reset his stance. His priests had given him the omens: a comet, a fire in the sky reflected in the lake, a temple that burned without apparent cause. These were catalogued in the years preceding contact in sources later preserved in documents like the Florentine Codex, compiled by Franciscan friar Bernardino de Sahagún across decades of interviews with Mexica survivors. He knew what was coming. The question, the only question that matters for this video, is what he did with what he knew. Look at the causeway again. Look at the stone. Look at the market of Tlatelolco, just north of the temple precinct, where on any given day, Hernán Cortés's own chroniclers counted more than 60,000 buyers and sellers, transacting in an orderly silence that amazed them. This was not a civilization in fear. This was a civilization in full operation, at full confidence, running on 4 generations of unbroken cosmological certainty. The Mexica sun Nahui Olin, the 5th sun, had survived 4 previous cosmic destructions. They knew this. Their priests had counted it. Their monuments encoded it. And the 5th sun survived precisely because the Mexica fed it. Every sacrifice, every campaign, every stone temple reaching toward a sky that had, so far, always held. That belief was not abstract. It was structural. And here is where the bias takes root. When Cortés arrived, Moctezuma did not have the option of simply updating his worldview. The worldview was the world. The cosmology was not a lens through which he saw reality. It was the architecture of reality itself. When evidence arrived that contradicted it, his mind did not abandon the architecture. It found a room for the evidence inside the existing structure. And so, the bias did its work.
The Codex foretells great change.
They had every warning. Now look at what they did with each one. Begin in 1517. 2 years before Cortés set foot on the causeway, the Mexica sky split open. A tongue of fire described in the Florentine Codex as a flaming ear of corn appeared in the eastern sky for 40 days before dawn. It rose, it blazed, it scattered light across the lake, and then it vanished. The priest read it and brought the reading to Moctezuma. He ordered additional sacrifices. The sky was not ignored. It was answered. This is the first thing to understand about the warnings Moctezuma received. He did not dismiss them. He processed them. Every omen that arrived was taken seriously, documented, discussed, and folded into a framework that had one foundational assumption. The Mexica were indispensable. The gods needed them. The sun rose because they fed it. Within that framework, a comet was not a signal of external threat. It was a demand for more devotion. He gave more devotion. The second warning arrived on water. In 1517 and again in 1518, Spanish expeditions under Francisco Hernández de Córdoba and Juan de Grijalva made contact with Mexica coastal subjects. The reports that reached Tenochtitlan described towers floating on the sea vessels, unlike any canoe, carrying men in metal skins, men who burned the air with a noise that killed. Moctezuma's Pacteca merchants on the Gulf Coast confirmed it. His coastal governors confirmed it. The intelligence was specific, repeated, and consistent. The Florentine Codex, Book 12, records that Moctezuma received these accounts and became, in the text's own phrasing, troubled, afflicted, that he could not eat, could not sleep. The Codex was compiled by Bernardino de Sahagún from direct Mexica testimony in the decades following the conquest. It is not a Spanish document. It is Mexica memory, preserved in Nahuatl. He was not ignorant. He was informed and distressed. The third warning was theological, and it cut deepest. The year 1519, on the European calendar, corresponded to the Mexica year 1 Reed Se Acatl. This was, in certain strands of Mexica religious tradition, the year associated with Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent deity, who in some accounts had departed eastward across the sea and was prophesied to return. Cortés arrived from the east, in one reed, with pale skin and dark beard. The match was not perfect. Scholars, including Camilla Townsend, writing in 2003, have argued the Quetzalcoatl identification may have been partly a post-conquest construction. But what matters here is not whether Moctezuma believed Cortés was a god. What matters is that the ambiguity itself was a warning. And ambiguity, when it threatens the foundations of belief, is the most dangerous kind, because ambiguity can be resolved in any direction you choose. And Moctezuma chose the direction that preserved the architecture. In 1956, a social psychologist named Leon Festinger published a study called Times When Prophecy Fails. He had not gone looking for civilization. He had gone looking for a doomsday cult in Minnesota. Festinger and his colleagues infiltrated a small group of believers who had received a divine message. The world would end on the 21st of December 1954, and they, the faithful few, would be carried to safety by flying saucer before the waters rose. He wanted to observe not what they believed, but what they did when the appointed hour passed and nothing came. The world did not end. No vessel descended. The believers sat in the dark, past midnight, and then past dawn. And then their leader announced a new message. Their faith had been so strong, their vigil so devoted, that the planet itself had been spared. The non-event had become evidence for the prophecy. In the days that followed, they did not retreat. They sought converts. Festinger noted that when a belief collapses against reality, the mind often responds not with doubt, but with recruitment, as though the agreement of others could replace the evidence that never came. They did not abandon the belief, they deepened it.
The stones remember what the books forget.
Festinger named the mechanism cognitive dissonance, the discomfort that arises when two contradictory things, a belief and a fact, occupy the same mind at the same moment. The mind, he argued, cannot sustain that tension for long. Something has to give. What gives is rarely the belief. This is how it works. You hold a conviction that is not merely a preference, it is structural. Your identity rests on it. Your social world confirms it. Your institutions were built to enforce it. Then evidence arrives that the conviction cannot accommodate. The mind does not say, I was wrong. The mind says, I can explain this. It reaches for a version of the evidence that fits inside the existing architecture. It renovates, it does not rebuild. Festinger never studied the Mexica. But the Lord of Tenochtitlan, descending from his litter to place gold around the neck of the man who would destroy him, was not behaving irrationally. He was doing exactly what Festinger predicted. The mechanism was already complete. It had been running for years.
We must not provoke them. They defile the temple, Lord.
The first decision was hospitality. Cortés and his men were given the palace of Axayacatl, Moctezuma's own father's palace, a compound large enough to house the entire Spanish force with room remaining. They were fed, they were supplied, their Tlaxcalan allies were quartered nearby. Moctezuma visited Cortés daily. He brought gifts in quantities that his own treasury would feel. Consider what this decision required Moctezuma to believe. Not that Cortés was harmless, he had the intelligence reports, he knew the weapons. Not that the Tlaxcalans were friendly, they were enemies of the Triple Alliance, and they were inside the city. Moctezuma required something more precise than ignorance. He required a story in which all of this was acceptable, in which the presence of 400 armed foreigners and thousands of hostile allied warriors within his capital was consistent with his civilization's permanence. He found the story. He had been finding it for 2 years. The second decision came 6 days after arrival. Cortés placed Moctezuma under house arrest. The justification was a Spanish soldier killed in a skirmish on the coast, an event Cortés used as pretext, and Moctezuma went. He walked from the palace, where he had been hosting the Spaniards, into Spanish custody, and he told his own lords, who arrived alarmed and ready to act, that this was voluntary, that he went of his own will. The account appears in Bernal Díaz, del Castillos por Historia Verdadera de la Conquista de la Nueva España, written from memory decades later. A contested source, but corroborated in its essential shape by indigenous records. He told his lords not to move. Here is the mechanism made visible. At the moment Moctezuma told his lords to stand down, he was not capitulating. He was resolving dissonance, the cognitive architecture that told him the Mexica were cosmologically indispensable, that the sun itself required their continuation, could not accommodate the alternative interpretation of what was happening. The alternative was that his city was being taken, that the empire was ending, that 4 generations of cosmological certainty were wrong, that interpretation was not available to him. Not because he lacked intelligence, because the mind does not offer interpretations that destroy it. So he chose the story that preserved the structure. He was managing this. He had a plan. He would allow this, and then he would act. He was not a prisoner. This was control of a different kind. The third decision was made for him. In June of 1520, with Cortés temporarily absent from the city, his lieutenant Pedro de Alvarado ordered the massacre of Mexica nobles gathered for the festival of Tenochtitlán. Hundreds died in the temple precinct. The city rose. And Moctezuma still held, still insisting on negotiation, still attempting to speak the dissonance away, stepped onto a wall to calm his own people. They threw stones at him. The accounts differ on what killed him. Spanish accounts say the stones. Mexica accounts say the Spanish did it after he was no longer useful. Both versions agree on one thing. He never stopped believing he could resolve it. And so the bias did its work. This is not a story about them. It has never been about them. You have a belief right now about your career, your relationship, your country, your body. That evidence has already begun to contradict. You have received the reports. Your version of the coastal governor's dispatch. The numbers that don't add up. The conversation that ended strangely. The thing you have read 3 times and each time found a different way to set down without resolving. You did not ignore it. Moctezuma did not ignore it either. That is the part people misunderstand when they encounter this story. Ignoring would be easier. What you did, what he did, is more precise. You processed the evidence and found a version of it that fit inside what you already knew to be true. You renovated, you told yourself, I can explain this. You found the room for the contradiction inside the existing structure. And the structure held, for now, and you felt something very close to relief. Leon Festinger documented this in his 1956 study, not as pathology, but as function. The mind in dissonance is not broken. It is working. It is doing exactly what it evolved to do, maintaining continuity, preserving the architecture of self against information that would require demolition. The question Festinger could not answer, the question no researcher has fully answered, is how long before the stones are already in the air. Because there is a moment, in every collapse, when the dissonance is still resolvable, when the evidence is present but not yet conclusive, when the story you are telling yourself still has enough room to stand. That moment does not announce itself. You will not know it has passed until you are already standing on the wall.
Gone. It is merely obscured by the smoke.
I have watched a great many walls. I have watched the people standing on them, rulers and soldiers and ordinary men and women who believed, until the last possible moment, that the story they were telling about their situation was the accurate one. Not because they were foolish, not because they deserved what came, because the mind is built to survive the present, and survival requires continuity, and continuity requires a story that holds together. Moctezuma was not a failure of intelligence. He was a demonstration of how intelligence works when it has too much invested in a single answer. The Mexica did not fall because they believed in the wrong gods.
There is no need to rush.
They fell because they could not afford to stop. That is the cost of a belief that has become structural. You stop carrying it, it carries you. If this reached something you recognized in yourself, in a decision you are still turning over, consider watching what comes next. The pattern does not belong to Tenochtitlan alone. We humans across time have been standing on the same wall, in different cities, under different skies, holding the same story a moment too long. The next video is already waiting. I will be there when you arrive.